Now, if you ask old folks in Harlem what happened after 1943, they'll tell you the war didn't really end. They'll tell you it just went quiet for a while. I want to be upfront with you before I go any further. A good part of what I'm about to tell you comes from community memory, not court records. Some of it is documented and agreed on. Some of it is legend that grew up around real men and real events, the way legend always does in a neighborhood that never had the newspapers on its side to begin with. I'll try to let you know which is which as we go. But I won't stop every few sentences to remind you. Just keep that in the back of your mind, the way you would listen to your own grandfather tell you something he heard from his. Now here's a piece of that story that sits more in Harlem's oral tradition than in any history book. The way it's always been told to me, Stephanie St. Clair had a hand in brokering some kind of peace between Bumpy Johnson and the men downtown after the violence of 1943. She'd run Harlem's numbers game herself once, long before Bumpy came up, and she understood how those men thought on both sides of that divide. I want to be straight with you. Historians don't treat that particular part as settled fact. It's a story Harlem tells about itself, and it's a good one, and there may well be truth buried in it, but I can't hand it to you as documented history. What does seem to hold up, from the outside record as well as the memory, is that whatever violence had flared up in 43 did quiet down for a stretch after that, and it held through the middle of the decade. 1943 slid into 44, and 44 into 45, and the war overseas was finally winding down. Everybody in this country had bigger things pulling at their attention than an old grudge between a black gangster uptown and some Italian men downtown. That's how the old folks told it anyway. Whether Bumpy actually let his guard down some in that stretch, or whether he stayed just as sharp as ever and simply got outmaneuvered, I couldn't tell you for certain. People lean one way or the other depending on how much they need Bumpy to be untouchable. Now here's something I do believe, because I've heard it from more than one direction. Men like Frank Costello don't forget easily. I don't care how many years pass, a man like that is supposed to keep a book in his head, and every dead soldier lost in that rhythm club shooting stays written down in there somewhere. Maybe that's a little bit of legend built up around a real man. Wouldn't surprise me, but it's the version that survived, and I think it survived because people who actually watched Costello operate over the years recognized something true in it. The story goes that his moment came back around in the spring of 1945. Picture it the way it was always described to me. The war in Europe is ending. Boys are starting to trickle home, radios in every window finally carrying good news instead of casualty counts. And in a stretch like that, when everybody's attention sits somewhere else, that's exactly the kind of window men like Costello are remembered as favoring. Nobody is watching too closely. There's a name that comes up here. A young fella named Sonny Franzese. He wasn't a made man yet in those years, just coming up, hungry, trying to prove himself. The story goes that it was Sonny who carried word to Costello that Bumpy's informant network wasn't what it used to be, that some of the cops on his payroll had died off, or stopped caring the way men do once the money slows. Whether that conversation happened word for word the way it's been passed down, of course I can't swear to. But that's how it's always been told to me, and I'll leave it there rather than keep circling back to it. That's when Costello is said to have decided to try again, and this time smarter than 43. No army is walking straight into a card game. This time, patient. This time, from the inside. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, the fellow they sent in. He's remembered as sending a man named Anthony Carfano, a smooth talker, well-dressed, the kind who could sit across from you and feel like a friend, right up until he wasn't. Carfano's job wasn't to kill anybody, not at first. It was to find a crack somewhere inside Bumpy's operation. Every operation's got one, they say. A man who's tired, or in debt, or watched other men climb higher while he stayed exactly where he was. Took a few months, so the story goes, before Carfano found his man, one of Bumpy's own lieutenants. I'm not going to give you a name here. Different tellings I've heard call him different things, and I figure it's more honest to leave him unnamed than to hand you a name I'm not sure of. What stays consistent is what he represented. Loyal for years, bled some for Bumpy, sat in cells for Bumpy, watched other men get rich while he stayed put. That kind of resentment doesn't always show on a man's face. It sits quietly in the chest for a long time. Money first, they say, then flattery, then a promise that once Bumpy was gone, this man would run Harlem himself with the commission's blessing. I'll be honest with you, this whole thread is the one I trust the least, because it shifts the most, depending on who's telling it. Some versions have him half forced into it through debt. Others make him greedy from the jump. Maybe there's some truth scattered across both. Through that spring and into summer, he's said to have started feeding small pieces downtown, where Bumpy stayed on witch nights. Which streets did he favor? And up top, in the daylight, from what people say, everything looked exactly the same. Bumpy was still walking Harlem as if it belonged to him, because in every way that mattered, it did. Still putting money into the churches, still helping families get back on their feet, with so many boys coming home needing work. This next part, I think, would have been around August of that year, maybe closer to September. I've heard it told both ways, but either way, it sat close to when Japan surrendered, and the war finally ended everywhere. Old folks used to talk about hearing radios through open windows that week, kids running loose down Lenox Avenue, people laughing louder than they'd laughed in years, strangers hugging on street corners like family. Harlem celebrated right along with the rest of the country. Maybe that's when Costello made his move. Maybe it wasn't that exact week at all. But old people always connected those two memories together when they told it to me. The celebration and the betrayal sitting close, as the story needed them near each other to mean something. The plan, as it's been passed down, wasn't a shootout this time. That lesson had already been paid for in blood back in '43. The idea was to use the lieutenant to get close enough that guns wouldn't be needed at all. Poison. Slow enough it wouldn't look like murder. Slow enough it would look like Bumpy's body finally giving out on him. No martyr, no folk hero story is spreading through the barbershops. Just an empty seat, and a lieutenant standing there ready to fill it. I'll admit that part always struck me as a little too neat, a little too much like something out of a picture. But more than one old-timer told it to me that way, so I'm passing it along as I got it. Here's where the story turns, and I trust this part more because it's always carried a more human shape than the rest. The lieutenant had a wife. People always said she loved Harlem the way some folks love a church. Grew up there, had people buried there. She found an envelope of money in his coat pocket that had no business being there, and she went digging quietly until she understood what he'd agreed to do. She didn't confront him. Instead, she got word to a woman working inside Bumpy's household, somebody she trusted, somebody who could carry a message straight to him without it passing through too many hands. I can't give you the exact words of that message, but the shape of it always comes out close to, watch your food, watch who's closest to you. Bumpy didn't panic over it, or so it's told. Sat with it, watched his own people a little closer for a couple of weeks without letting on. Fed a few false locations to a handful of men, one at a time, just to see where trouble showed up. And trouble, the story goes, showed up right where the lieutenant had been told to expect him. What happened next is where the story really splits depending on who's telling it, and I'd rather be honest about that than pretend there's one clean version. Some say Bumpy called the man in alone and just asked if it had been worth it. Some say the man begged, not for his own life, but for his family to be left out of it. Bumpy's remembered as telling him his family had nothing to do with what he'd chosen, and sending him out of Harlem for good instead of killing him. That's the version that survived, and I think it survived partly because people like a story where mercy means something. Whether it happened word for word like that or not, memory has a way of polishing an edge until it fits the shape people need it to have. What holds steady across most tellings is that the lieutenant wasn't killed. He disappeared from Harlem one way or another, and that unsettled the men downtown more than a killing would have. A killing they knew how to read. Mercy used like a weapon was something else, and it told Costello he was still somehow behind Bumpy, even after all that careful planning. Costello wasn't a man remembered for quitting after one failed plan, however much time he'd sunk into it. And this next part is the one that gives the story its name, because it's closer to what people usually picture when they think about a real mob war. After the plan with the lieutenant collapsed, he's said to have gone back to something more direct, though smarter than 43. Instead of a crew of Italian men who'd stand out walking through Harlem, he found men who could move through the neighborhood without drawing an eye. 3 of them, the story goes, were men who'd do violent work for whoever paid best. They watched for weeks that fall, learning when Bumpy visited his mother, which restaurants he favored, and the small habits even careful men fall into over time. No man alive stays on guard every hour of every day forever. That's not how a person survives, mentally, year after year. The attack came on an evening sometime that November, outside a restaurant on Lenox Avenue, where Bumpy was known to eat with a few of his closest men. Nobody who was actually standing there left behind a written account that I know of. What survives is word of mouth, carried the way most of Harlem's real history got carried in those days, since the papers downtown mostly ignored what happened uptown unless it was scandal. What almost every version agrees on is that the three men made their move as Bumpy was leaving, and that it should have worked. They had a surprise. They had the numbers. What they didn't have was the same thing that had undone the 43 attempt, just in a different shape. Harlem watched its own. There's supposed to have been an old man selling newspapers on that corner, somebody nobody paid much mind to most days, who noticed three men lingering too long, watching that door too closely. And he sent word, the way people in that neighborhood are remembered as always doing. By the time the three men moved, Bumpy's own people were already circling behind them. What was meant to be an ambush turned into the ambushers getting surrounded instead. There was gunfire that night, brief, over quickly by most tellings. One of the three men didn't survive it. The other two were taken, not killed, taken somewhere private. Funny thing about memory, here's the part that always sticks with me most, more than the gunfire even. Nobody who's ever told me this story spent much time on the shooting itself. What people always remembered, what always got told with the most weight behind it, was what happened to those two men afterward. Bumpy didn't kill them either. Had them driven out of the city blindfolded and let go, alive, unharmed, with a message to carry back. I can't give you the exact words, same as before, but it always comes out close to something like, "Go back and tell Mr. Costello that Harlem doesn't need to kill his men to win anymore, that he can go home and wonder if the mercy holds next time." Whether Bumpy actually spoke a line that clean, I have my doubts, honestly. Real men in real fear don't usually talk that tidy. But that's the shape the story took as it got carried forward, and there's usually a seed of something true buried even in the parts that got polished up along the way. That's a different kind of ending than 43. Back then, Bumpy won with guns and blood, and it made him into something like a legend, a name the barbershops couldn't stop repeating. In 45, he won something quieter. Costello's own informant was discovered and sent home in shame, instead of being killed as a warning. His hired men captured instead of fighting to the death. Every move he made, however careful, seemed to come back and turn on him somehow. From here, the historical record gets a little clearer about Bumpy's later life. As for another direct attempt from Costello, historians haven't found clear evidence of one. Whether that's because it never happened, or because no record of it survived, I couldn't tell you. What I can tell you is that the ending Harlem settled on, the one that got carried forward, was that Costello backed off Harlem for good after that year. There's a story attached to it too, one I can't promise is any truer than the rest, that Costello was heard saying years later that Harlem was the one piece of territory in the whole city he'd learned to leave be. Not out of respect, the story goes, out of arithmetic. Mind you, what happened to Bumpy after all this? What's on firmer ground, since more of it has been written down elsewhere over the years. He kept running Harlem into the late 40s and through the 50s, through his own troubles with the law, through prison, through everything that came his way after. But that fall of 45 is remembered as the last time anybody downtown seriously tried to take Harlem by force. Whatever arrangement existed after that, Harlem's old-timers always remembered Bumpy as the man who never let anyone simply walk in and take what was his. I think about that lieutenant sometimes, whoever he really was. Nobody I've ever talked to agrees on what became of him. Some say he lived out his years somewhere far off, never able to come home. Others say worse things caught up to him eventually, that Bumpy's mercy didn't necessarily mean safety from everybody else who might have judged him for it. That's the nature of a story like this one. It gets carried person to person, changing a little every time it passes through somebody new, until what you're holding isn't so much a set of facts anymore as a feeling about who these people were. Funny thing is, in almost every version I've heard, nobody remembers the gunfire much at all. What people always remembered, what always got told with the most weight, was the betrayal and the mercy that came after it. Whether every detail happened exactly this way, I don't know. Memory isn't a courtroom, and old neighborhoods have a way of polishing a story as it passes hand to hand down through the years. But if nothing else, this is the story Harlem chose to remember, and sometimes the stories a community keeps tell you as much about its people as the records ever could.